This video is brought to you by Sailrite. Visit Sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. This video will show you in detail how to set up your Sailrite Fabricator Sewing Machine from beginning to end. The Sailrite Fabricator Sewing Machine is shipped in 4 boxes. All components are packed very well, so shipping damage is almost totally eliminated. First, we'll unbox the sewing machine head. The Sailrite Fabricator is double boxed, and inside the second box you'll find sew-off samples that were actually sewn on your sewing machine. We'll remove all of the components within the box. Remove the foam on top of the sewing machine head. Then you may need a second helper to help you pull the sewing machine out of the box. Grab it from underneath the throat of the sewing machine and then carefully place it on a table. Be careful, the legs of the sewing machine head may scratch tabletop surfaces. There's an oil pan still in the box. Be sure to remove it. The black rubber packing discs at the corner of the oil pan should be removed. They can be discarded. Your new Sailrite Fabricator Sewing Machine has been set up and tested thoroughly at the Sailrite headquarters. It has also been well lubricated. If you notice excess oil on the sewing machine head, just simply use a rag and wipe it up. The Sailrite highly recommends that you save the box and the foam that the head was shipped in, just in case you need to send the head back to Sailrite for service. There are 4 total boxes that come with your sewing machine. We'll now open up the box that contains the Sailrite workhorse servo motor and other components. Inside of one of these 2 smaller boxes, there'll be an instructional manual that'll help walk you through the process of setting up your sewing machine. Now that we've found the 4-color guidebook, we can continue to open up the other boxes, removing all of the components. We will not at this time open up the Sailrite workhorse servo motor. We'll do that later on. This next box contains the K-legs. It also has the treadle and all of the screws that will be required to build the leg assembly. The last box is the tabletop. We'll open one end. Then fold the flaps back and carefully tip the box up, holding the table in the box until it reaches the floor, then pulling the box off of the table. There are a lot of screw accessories that come with the Sailrite Fabricator Sewing Machine. These are the ones that we'll use, but it also includes some components that will not be used, since the K-legs are used for other packages as well. As we walk you through this video, we'll show you what screws are required for each step along the way. Next up, installing the power stand. First, stand both K-legs upright and bolt the back support bar to the bottom hole at the back of the table legs. To accomplish this, we'll be using these components. A washer will go on the bolt. Then that bolt is inserted through the rear of the support brace and into the K-leg. Then the square washer goes on the end of the bolt. Then the nut. Simply hand tighten at this point. Do the same on the opposite side. Now flip the legs upside down and place the treadle mount bar at the back of the forwardmost slots. These are the 4 bolts, nuts, and washers that you will require. To secure the treadle mount bar, simply insert the bolts through the bottom, which is actually the top because the table is upside down. Place a washer and a nut on each. 2 bolts per side. We will push the bar back to the back portion of the slot. Before tightening all the nuts and bolts, you may want to use a square and be sure everything is as square as possible. You may not be able to achieve it being perfectly square, but it can come very close. Then tighten all of the bolts and nuts. After the tabletop and sewing machine is mounted on the K-legs, we'll come back to these nuts and bolts and tighten them up completely, eliminating almost all wobble. Now find the tabletop and place it on top of a surface, as shown here in the video. The K-legs will be assembled on the table like this, but first we need to move them aside and make some measurements on the underside of the tabletop. On the end that has the belt slot, measure over a 1/2 inch from the edge of the table. We'll now place the K-legs on top of that table on the bottom side and line it up with those 1/2 inch marks we just made. Along the back edge, measure in 1.5 inches and place a mark there. At the opposite end, do the same at the back edge there. Measure in 1.5 inches where the legs sit and place a mark. Use a pencil to mark the screw locations for attaching the K-leg frame to the tabletop. Be sure the K-legs are lined up on the marks you just made. Now we can move the K-legs, and using a 5/32 inch drill bit, we can drill about halfway into the tabletop. Do not drill completely through the tabletop and come through the outer surface. That would be a bad thing. You're simply making pilot holes that only go halfway through the tabletop thickness. To fasten it, we'll use the hex head lag screws, locking washer, and washers. We typically insert each screw in the middle position of the slot, and then we'll use a socket to tighten down the screws, completely locking the K-legs to the underside of the tabletop. The Sailrite Fabricator comes with a handy drawer. We'll install that next. When the stand is upright, of course it's upside down here, the drawer mounts to the forward left underside of the table. We'll use these 6 screws to install the rails. There are 8 holes in the rails, though we're only going to use 3 in each side. The drawer should pull open from the front of the table, and when pushed in, it will hit a stop. Secure the rails to the underside of the table with the included 6 screws. Here Bill is marking where the rails should be located. Then he uses an awl in 3 of the 4 holes on each rail. You can also use a pencil if you do not have an awl to mark the hole locations. Once the positioning for the rails is determined, you can move the drawer and install the rails. Do not over-tighten the screws, or the drawer may not slide easily. Now the drawer can be pushed through the front of the rail system and will come upon the stop. Installing cushions to the bottom of the K-leg is next. There are 4 rubber foot pads. Stretch the K-leg foot pads onto the rectangular metal feet of the table legs. It's that easy. Next, we'll install the treadle. We'll now flip the table on its side as shown here. You'll need all these components to install that treadle. The position of the treadle on the treadle mount bar is up to the end user. Some prefer the center position, as shown here. Others prefer the right offset position. Unfortunately, you won't know what you like best until you use the sewing machine. If you'd like to try a different position, feel free to move it after you use the sewing machine for a while. Here, Bill will mount the treadle in the right offset position. The 2 end pivots fit into the sides of the treadle pedal. They are bolted to the mount bar with 4 bolts, 2 on each end pivot. One side of the treadle has holes. It is positioned towards the back of the table. Here, Bill is just using the treadle to determine the position for the end pivot. Then he'll put the treadle down and install the end pivot in that slot. Install the pivots first, but don't tighten them completely. This enables you to place the treadle between the pivots. Later on, after you're satisfied with its position, you can then lock the nuts. Bill is satisfied with the operation of the treadle, so he'll lock the nuts now in place. Ensure that the treadle pivots freely after tightening down. We can now bolt the L bracket to the holes on the back of the treadle, so that its shorter leg is sticking out towards the back of the table, pointing towards the workhorse servo motor, which will be installed later. To secure this L bracket, you'll use 2 small bolts, 2 small nuts, and 2 small washers. Tighten it down. Coming up, we'll need to find the workhorse servo motor box and unpack it so we can install it. Now find the workhorse servo motor box and open it up. Inside you'll find many components, including the instructional manual, the linkage bars, 2 pulleys, that's at least on top of it. Underneath it, you'll find the workhorse servo motor. To remove it, we'll turn the box upside down and then pull off the tape around the perimeter of the foam. Now you'll find not only the workhorse servo motor, but also the belt cover and screws. The instructional manual in the workhorse servo box has mounting instructions and also how to work the motor. For the Sailrite Fabricator Sewing Machine, we will be using the clogged pulley. You'll find a key in its bag. There's the key. You'll also need the lock nut, washer, and the lock washer. They are sometimes found in the other pulley's bag. The other pulley is not for the Sailrite Fabricator. The black clogged pulley is. The key sometimes does not fit well. If this key does not, there is a second key. Try it. If they both do not fit well into the groove on the shaft, then take some pliers and some sandpaper or emery cloth and grind the key slightly. It may need to be honed down to enable it to fit well in the slot of the pulley and the slot of the shaft. Here it's been ground down a little bit. Let's try it out. As you can see, it now will fit into the slot on the shaft. We will have to use a tool to push it into position. Sometimes it can be done with your fingers, but oftentimes it'll take a hard tool to push it securely up against the flange of that shaft. Line up the slot in the pulley with the key and push it onto the shaft. There are 2 set screws on that pulley. You can cinch them down once the pulley's in place, or they can be removed completely since we're using a key and a nut to hold the pulley in place. We just want to keep them from flying out once the machine's in use. Now we will insert the large washer, the lock washer, then the locking nut onto the shaft. As soon as the locking nut is threaded a quarter of the way down, it will become very difficult to turn. You'll need to use a wrench to turn it the rest of the way. You'll also need to hold on to the pulley as you tighten down the lock nut. It should be tightened onto the shaft so that it engages the lock washer underneath and no tighter. There's no need to put excessive force on this lock nut, just enough to compress the lock washer underneath the lock nut. The Sailrite workhorse motor is now ready to mount. Usually the sewing machines come with 2 linkage bars. You'll just use one. We typically choose the longer one. These are the accessories found in the workhorse servo motor box. They will be used to mount the motor and install it. First, we're going to mount a portion of the shield onto the end of the workhorse servo motor using the included screws. Do not tighten the screws down completely yet. And be sure to mount the shield in such a way that the top portion is facing towards the front of the motor, as seen here. We'll now be working with the table on the floor. We'll use the rest of the components to secure the motor to the tabletop. Place 2 of the 3 included carriage bolts into the leftmost holes. The threaded side of the bolts will extend below the table. Then carefully pound the heads, the hex portion of the head, into the tabletop. Place a washer, lock washer, and then nut on each of the 2 bolts and thread them roughly halfway. Then slide the motor bracket onto the 2 bolts so the washers and the nuts are holding the motor to the table. Now you can place the 3rd carriage bolt through the remaining hole on the tabletop, making sure that it's through the final slot in the motor bracket. Place the final washer, lock washer, and nut on the bolt. We're going to hand tighten the nuts at this point. We will also try to align the motor so that its pulley is even with the slot at the top of the tabletop. It is highly likely that we'll have to make final adjustments after the head and the belt are positioned. For now, we'll leave it fairly snug here. The linkage bar connects the treadle to the motor. That's next. Now we'll take one of the linkage bars and remove the nut and lock washer from it. If your sewing machine came with 2 linkage bars, you will only need 1. We'll bolt the linkage bar to the outermost hole of the motor operation lever on the workhorse servo motor. The opposite end will attach to the L bracket on the treadle. We'll then use a wrench and tighten down the outer nut until it compresses the lock washer and comes up against the inner nut. The bolt at the center of the linkage can be used to adjust the angle of the pedal to your liking. Now, before we insert the sewing machine, we should make height adjustments to the table, if desired. To make table height adjustments, the bolt on the linkage arm needs to be released. Before placing the sewing machine in the tabletop, it's a good idea to adjust the table legs' height to your desired location. Release the 4 bolts that hold the top portion to the K legs. Then, using the chair that you plan to sew with, adjust the height, being sure that the table is level. Adjusting the height of the tabletop is always easier with a second person. Once you've achieved the appropriate height that you desire and it's level, you can lock those bolts back into position. The oil pan and the head installation is coming up. Next, we'll work on the oil pan. We'll insert the tapered end of the knee lift post connector into the raised hole in the bottom of the oil tray. Locate the corner cushions. They'll have a slot in the middle. Insert the smaller ones to the back of the oil pan. The back of the oil pan does not have the post in the front. The larger ones go in the front portion of the oil pan. Then it can be slipped into the tabletop. You may need to push these corner pads into position to mount them appropriately. They should almost be flush with the tabletop. You'll next find the rubber base for Euro hinge. There'll be 2 of them. Place them into the respective tabletop cavities. Push the machine support pin into the hole in the tabletop nearest the carriage bolts holding the motor. Insert the 2 chrome hinges into the holes in the back of the sewing machine base. Inside the tool bag, you'll find a round magnet. Remove it and place it at the bottom of the oil pan in the deepest section. This magnet will help eliminate metal shavings in our oil bath. Now grasp the sewing machine under the arm of the sewing machine and gently place it into the tabletop cutout. Plug the workhorse servo motor in and be sure that it turns counterclockwise. If it does not, refer to the workhorse instructions for how to make it turn counterclockwise. Only the Sailrite Fabricator has the Stitch Pro balance wheel and the posi pin system. That's next. You'll find 4 screws near the shaft where the balance wheel is mounted. They're almost gold in color. Remove all 4 of those screws. The top 2 screws will have washers. The bottom 2 will not. Position the C-shaped belt guard and reinstall the screws, making sure washers are positioned as shims behind the guard to keep it from being bent out of shape. There are only 2 washers, and we typically install them on this single screw here, both of them. To attach this C-shield, we will only use 3 of the 4 screws we removed. The 4th screw will be used for the outer portion of the belt cover. This screw at the top, at the back corner, we typically do not use a shim behind it. The 3rd screw here at the bottom is larger, and there is no washer or shim placed behind it. We'll cinch all these screws down, but we need to make sure that we don't cinch them down too much. This is a plastic belt cover, and we may need to make adjustments when the exterior belt cover is put on. Right now we're going to assume we don't have to. You will find the posi pin in the parts bag here. On the end of the shaft, unscrew the posi pin nut. It is reverse threaded, so you'll need to turn it clockwise to remove it. Then slide on the Stitch Pro balance wheel. To thread the posi pin nut on, turn it counterclockwise. If the balance wheel hits the belt cover, reposition the washers placed under the C-shaped belt guard, or move the bushing out further by loosening the set screws in the bushing. Now comes the belt installation. Before installing the drive belt, loosen the screw to allow the workhorse servo motor to freely pivot. The linkage bar to the treadle may restrict the movement of the motor. If so, release the bolt holding the linkage bars together. With the machine tilted back, slip the drive belt over the balance wheel track and guide it onto the motor pulley. Then carefully lower the machine into the cutout. If the belt tightens up prematurely, push the motor forward. Proper adjustment of the belt results in 3/8 inch of slack when pressed by finger at its center location. Once that is achieved, retighten the set screw. If the linkage bar screw that connects the two bars together is tight, you may have a hard time adjusting the motor. It should be loose when making adjustments to the belt. Now rotate the balance wheel forward and watch how the belt travels. If it travels to the left side or the right side, you may need to adjust the placement of the motor, left or right. Here we need to push the motor towards the right side or towards the balance wheel to fine-tune the travel of the belt so it's directly above the cogs. We still need to go a little bit more here. Now rotate the balance wheel and it travels perfectly on the Stitch Pro balance wheel. Once that is achieved, tighten up the 3 nuts mounting the motor to the tabletop. Then check belt tension yet again. When we were rotating the balance wheel, notice the posi pins in the keeper. It wasn't engaging the needle drive. For your safety, we'll now show you how to attach the balance wheel belt cover. To install the balance wheel belt cover, it has a keyway that locks onto the post of the C-shaped belt guard that was secured to the machine earlier. Then use one of the screws that was removed earlier and screw it into this slot of the balance wheel belt cover. Position the screw in the slot to provide proper belt clearance, typically all the way to the right end of the slot. Installation of the bobbin winder is next. Now we'll attach the bobbin winder. It screws into the tabletop. The large wheel of the winder should be at least an 1/8 inch forward of the belt. In other words, no contact. And in line with the belt. That needs to be determined with the belt winder disengaged, in other words, pushed away from the belt. It should also be parallel to the belt slot in the table. Then mark the location in each of the slots where the screws will be positioned. You'll find the screws and washers in the parts accessory bag. Bill tilts the sewing machine back so that he can pre-drill the holes. Using a drill bit of 5/32 inch or slightly smaller, he drills a hole about 3/8 inch deep. Because the bobbin winder has slots, you can push the bobbin winder forward or backwards to find the optimal position for bobbin winding and for the large wheel on the bobbin winder to contact the belt appropriately and to disengage the belt when the bobbin is full. When the bobbin winder is disengaged, that large wheel on the bobbin winder should be about an 1/8 inch away from the belt. For great illumination, Sailrite's provided the Flex 20 LED light. The Flex 20 LED light has a magnetic base and will obviously stick to anything that is magnetic. If using the included plastic clips with an adhesive backing, be sure to clean the surface with an alcohol prep pad first to wipe off any excess oil. Then you can use the zip ties to position the cable. The Workhorse servo motor has a plug for the light. Simply plug it into the back of the Workhorse servo motor, and your Flex 20 light is now ready for action. Before we can install the industrial thread stand, we need to assemble it. Onto the lower post, mount the arm that has the holes in the top. Then use the screws to lock it into position. There is a clamp in the center that connects the upper post. Use the 2 screws there to lock that post onto the lower post. Pull the plastic cap off the top of the post and then slide the next arm onto that post as shown here in the video. This is the arm that will accept the thread. Then tighten it a few inches from the top. Then replace the plastic cap. Assemble the base where the cone of thread will rest as shown here in the video. Push the post through the plastic base until the 2 notches line up with the notches in the plastic base. Then remove the nut and the lock washer. Insert the bottom portion of the threaded post through the hole of the arm, then reinsert the lock washer and then screw the nut onto the threaded post. Then use a wrench to cinch up the nuts. Do this for the second base as well as the first. Then slide the foam discs over the top of the posts. Then push the cone onto the posts. They will be rather stubborn to push on, so be sure to support the bottom of the base as you push them onto the posts. Now your thread stand is assembled. Remove the plastic end cap at the bottom and remove the nut and the metal washer. Leave the plastic washer and regular washer on. Then slide it through the hole in the tabletop. Then reinsert the washer and the nut and tighten down the nut. The Sailrite Fabricator has a 9/16" foot lift when using the knee lever. We're going to show you how to install the knee lever next. Expand the edges of the rubber pad so it fits onto the circular disc here. Then install the long arm through the two holes of that disc with the locking mechanism in the center of those two holes. Using a wrench, you can lock it in position, but you may need to make adjustments later on. This clamping mechanism slides onto the post that is installed in the oil tray. The top bolt will lock it onto the post. When you find the optimal position, that bolt will need to be tightened very tightly, otherwise it will slip on the post. The bolt that is facing Bill will lock the knee lever at your optimal position. Pushing the knee lever to the right will lift the presser foot, as you can see here. Pushing the lever in the back of the sewing machine will keep the presser foot up. Before adjusting the knee lever, the sample under the foot must be removed. After the sample is removed, then you can lower the lever. Now we can fine-tune the knee lever to our desired position. This screw under the oil pan determines how much play there is in the knee lift lever. We want very little play. So here he reverses the nut so that he can adjust it. He just wants a little bit of slop in the knee lever. A little bit more. A little bit more. That's almost perfect. Now that he's found the appropriate position, he will lock the nut down. The screw on the right, closest to the belt, will influence how high the foot will raise. Loosen the nut and lower the set screw, or raise the set screw until the optimal position is achieved. Push the knee lift lever until the feet are near the max height possible. That maximum height is a 1/2 inch to 9/16 inch. Then tighten the set screw until it touches the oil tray. Then tighten the nut to hold its location. If that set screw is not set, it's possible that you can lift the machine right out of the tabletop slightly, so be sure to set it. Feel free to make adjustments to the knee lever until you find the optimal position for your particular applications. Only a few more steps and your Sailrite Fabricator sewing machine will be assembled. The back bracket of the belt cover has been installed loosely on the workhorse servo motor. We will tilt it so that it's in line with the belt and tighten the 3 set screws holding that cover onto the workhorse servo motor. Then we'll slide the belt cover onto the bracket. Be sure the belt does not touch the belt cover. If you so choose, you can use this screw which comes with the workhorse servo motor to lock the cover in place. The Sailrite Fabricator has an oil pump system. We need to fill the reservoir. Everything is almost all assembled. The only thing left to do now is to pour the oil into the oil pan. You'll notice a low and a high level. So now we'll take the oil that's provided and pour it into the oil pan. Now we just need to check to make sure the workhorse servo motor works properly. If the motor is turned on when the lever to actuate the motor is not touching the silver knob here, the motor will not work. To correct this, turn the motor off and then readjust the linkage rod so the lever touches the silver knob. Once that is achieved, you can relock the linkage bar and then turn the motor back on, and you should have a working motor again. Many of our customers prefer the treadle to be tilted at a different position. That can be done via the linkage arm locking nut in the center. Once you find the appropriate tilt that is most comfortable for you, you can lock that nut down. Just be sure that, as we discussed earlier, When the foot treadle is disengaged, the lever comes in contact with the silver knob above. Assembly is complete, but the table is a little bit wobbly. To resolve this issue, simply go back to all of the nuts and bolts and tighten them thoroughly. Only do this to the nuts and bolts on the K-leg assembly. Once this is done, it will stabilize the machine and make it much more rigid. So now, after all of the nuts and bolts have been tightened, it is obviously much more rigid, as you can see here in the video. Enjoy your Sailrite Fabricator Compound Walking Foot Sewing Machine. If you have questions, be sure to give us a call at Sailrite or email us. We're glad to help. Click here to see related videos to the Sailrite Fabricator Sewing Machine. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.